Welcome to Conversations with the Authors.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Daniel Troop.
And I'm Daryl.
And I'm Sandra.
And I'm Nicole.
Our special guest today, who is a Master of Education, right? Or you have a...
Master's of Arts and Teaching.
Okay, yes, a Master of Education, ladies and gentlemen.
They're slightly different.
And if you were with us last week, we're just coming off the American Library Association, where Daryl and Sandra did signings of their highly rated Eric Hoffman nominated sci-fi fantasy novel, How Nicholas Became Santa Claus. I say this because 50,000 people is a lot of readers, and I'm betting that a lot of those readers started young. And today we're going to talk about the importance of reading, not just as children, just being young in general and picking up a book once in a while.
It's important, isn't it, if you're going to be a writer, to be a reader, correct?
Yes. So I guess we'll start. Why does it matter? Why does it matter that we start reading when we're younger?
Well, for starters, the vast majority of your brain development happens between birth and the age of 5.
Yes.
So this is when it's really relevant and important to develop your brain pathways and just get your mind working, and you create those
So it's
pathways.
sort of a whole, if you don't use it, you lose it kind of scenario.
Yes.
Probably if you don't use it, you don't even get it.
Right.
True. So this is, first of all, thank you, listeners, for pressing the play button. And thank you, Alexander Nakarada, who wrote the music to the podcast. And I'm sure that he had to learn to read notes, right? To write the theme. So starting to read in the beginning is important for developing all sorts of crazy skills in life, right? You know, critical thinking and problem solving. And would reading science fiction also have some good benefits? Science fantasy fiction, what do you guys think?
I think it would, because your mind is like a muscle sometimes, I like to liken it to, and it has to be stretched. And I think science fiction and fantasy can really stretch that muscle.
Yes.
You know, and you come out of the ordinary reality of life, all of its rules and its physics, but you get to bend those rules with science fiction and fantasy. And it's amazing how expansive that can be, you know, if you really use your imagination.
And if you use your imagination, just imagine a child's brain, say like our grandchildren who are currently a year old, and their brains are like silly putty. Anything I smush the silly putty into, it sticks to them like glue. And I can stretch it and make them look like something else, and I can smoosh it together and start all over again.
Yeah, so child's mind is very malleable, I think, Nicole, right?
I think that's why Nicole's an educator, because she knows they need to be stretched out.
I guess teaching children younger for language purposes is great, because they're so spongy. They sort of soak it up, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, a child's brain is like a dry sponge.
Right.
It's a blank slate. So you can put a lot of information into it, and they will retain it for life.
Right. But also, too, and we're not just talking about kids. We're talking about, young adults. We're talking about people who are, middle school, high school. This is where they're getting they're learning how to think and problem solve, right?
Yeah, I think learning, thinking, and problem solving starts from the very beginning, and I think it starts at that so-called blank slate, which is, it has some aptitudes to it already. But I like to say to people that I see a lot of children as a psychiatrist, but I tell my adults that all the children I ever saw, all the adults I ever saw, rather, had been children.
Yeah.
So you want to start things as young as and early as possible.
Right. But we were talking earlier, outside of the recording, about reading, and we were talking about story time, and story time isn't just for
Small
little
children. It is said that story time is effective all the way into adulthood. And it's a shame that we stop doing that after children hit a certain age and they're still very much minors, because story time stimulates the brain.
Right.
It helps your comprehension, your memory.
Yes.
It piques your imagination. And then depending on the topic, typically stories pose a problem.
Right.
So you have to use your mind to analyze and solve this problem, especially if it's something like sci-fi or mystery or anything of the like, romance even. It's like, oh, what am I going to do about this person who did this thing? Or it could be something relatable to life. And so they can take that story and then they start connecting dots to what they're going through as well.
And that's an interesting point Nicole makes about making these connections. And we talked earlier about Nicholas resonating with the audience. So when you wrote how Nicholas became Santa Claus, were you thinking about your audience and who your readers would be when they're picking up this material and this wonderful fantasy world full of magic and creatures? And
Yes, I was.
Yeah, we wanted to keep that in mind. I don't know if anybody knows this, but the average novel is written for fifth grade, for the fifth grader.
Are you smarter than a fifth grader?
No,
Right. You know, really, when you think about it, because there are certain levels that you write at depending on what you're trying to do. If I were writing an insurance policy, I might write at a college level, you know, and I put all the lingo and all of that other mystic stuff in there. But if I were writing to tell a story to just the general public, something entertaining and something where they could really enjoy, most authors will tell you they'll write it at about a fifth grade level. That's not an insult to the people who read, but I think it's that sweet spot that seems to be able to get everything over to your reader.
You know, it's interesting you say that, because when I was studying at Columbia College in screenwriting, one of the things that our professor would say is you have to write at a seventh grade level. You write for seventh graders. So, because your average reader is going to read sort of at that pace, and it's not to undermine the intelligence of the reader.
No, not at all. You know, but one thing I think that you don't want somebody to do is turning to a dictionary every time they turn a page.
I think that it's about, you know, the sweet spot. You know, I think
It's
seventh
about
grade
the resonance.
is
They understand the language that's being used at that level, and it also allows for them to see the direct cause and effect. Here's the problem, here's how to solve it, and if I do this different, I can prevent the whole thing.
I think Nicole will probably agree that you don't want your reader to have to stop every other paragraph and go to thesaurus to try to find out what you meant.
But I think also too, that's not to say you should encourage readers to say, hey, that's a new word, let's find out what that means. Or, you know, what other words could I use in its place? Because a lot of our listeners are writers, or trying to be writers, and they're trying to learn how to, you know, play with the language to get their story across. And a lot of the times, it's trying not to be repetitive, right?
And if you look in our book, you'll notice that anytime we used a new term, we immediately defined it afterwards.
Well, we didn't define it in the way a dictionary might define it, but we defined it in the context of the story.
Right.
So
the old context clue.
Right, context. You can learn a lot from context.
Which is another reason why it's important to read at a young age, because you're learning how to use context clues. So like, oh, if this was happening, then this must mean this.
Yes, you learn to sort of associate and, you know, critical think these things through.
I was going to say that. That's
There's a new program out that was just discussed in one of the physicians assisting magazines at a convention, where they're utilizing grade school between preschool and sixth grade at nursing homes, asking the patients who have been defined as having dementia to help these children learn how to read, because it reminds their brain
Wow.
that, hey, I know how to do this. I know what that means.
Can I add a little an addendum to that?
Please.
Of course.
One of the things about Alzheimer's and dementia is that people have a problem with recent memory, but they don't have a big problem with long-term memory. Very long-term memory is stored all over the brain. So they don't have the problem to retrieve that as they would if they just met somebody yesterday and they can't remember their name today. You know, and that's why sometimes relatives who are new get referred to as somebody they used to know a long time
That's
ago
right.
because they have a hard time remembering recent things.
The
But
pro-
yeah, I see your point on that.
But the program's actually called My New Grandma and Grandpa
Oh, that's wonderful.
Teach Me How to Read.
But if you're going to be a writer, folks, you have to read.
Right.
You have
Absolutely.
to learn something. You learn something from the writers
Right.
that you read.
But that isn't to say that you have to read, Pride and Prejudice and all these big novels. I think, as I was speaking to someone who she was sharing how to speak a particular language online, and she had said that there were several books that she had wanted to learn to read, or learn to read because people said they should read them. But it's not what you read, but that you read, I think, is what's important.
Reading can be really a wellspring
Yes.
of inspiration.
So whether you're reading articles on the internet, or you're reading comic books or manga or movie scripts or, pamphlets, it's engaging your mind in, I guess, different things, really. But also reading at a young age helps, I think, promote problem solving. I think it helps promote dealing with moral or issues, because your story, How Nicholas Became Santa Claus, deals with a lot of issues that young adults will deal with. It talks about romance, it talks about death, it talks about war, it talks about all sorts of things that we face in the real world.
And aside from it being science fiction fantasy,
Yes.
we have a real story
Yes.
of a boy coming to age. It's a coming of age story, and that's common to all human beings. We all come to age, hopefully.
And of course, and of course, this is not a research-based conversation. This is really just us talking as we normally do, off script. There's no script. We just, have all been around. So I wonder, Nicole, do you feel like, that these are things that our young readers are can take from the stories, that these themes, these scenarios, they can sort of relate to in their own world?
Oh, absolutely. And one thing that's even interesting about it is you don't even have to relate. Sometimes you can be in direct opposition
Yes.
with what you read,
Yes.
and that'll have you thinking in a completely different manner,
Right.
and it'll spark debate,
Oh, yes.
a different way of thinking.
That's right.
Oh, yes, yes.
Right, absolutely.
Because a good way of thinking this is I don't like the idea of this, or I don't like the thinking on this. And now, why don't I like it?
And it forces you to elaborate.
Right.
So
And when you read a science fiction fantasy text, you really engage with it. You can express different perspectives or get different perspectives. And so we always want to round ourselves out, and I think we can do that by reading. Reading is very, 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 and I'm going to say it, it's fundamental.
right.
Yes.
And it broadens your horizons because you can learn about different cultures, different practices, different food, and you don't have to leave your home to do that.
Right.
So you're exposed to a completely different way of thinking. Like, I can read about China if I wanted to. I can read about South Africa. I can read about anything.
Right. And in the
Mars.
same in the same manner, just as you mentioned, it gets us involved in STEM in some way, in the sciences and maths,
Right,
English,
it does.
and we have an exposure to it that may make us feel we want to know more. Just like reading How Nicholas Became Santa Claus, reading all of these eccentric characters, magical creatures, and all these adventures that he's going on with these eclectic characters, makes you want to know more about him and about the world of the kingdoms of Illumine and all of the, the denizens therein. And you guys do, every time I say it, you do a fantastic job really putting it all together.
We appreciate that, and please keep saying it.
I will. Well, and I think also too, it helps us to learn to be, and we talked about in some of our previous podcasts, we talked about speculative writing, right? Futurists, right? Mm-hmm. What could the future hold? What might it be? What if this could happen? And I think reading simply allows us to be able to do that. Would you agree?
Because it goes back to imagination.
It goes back to imagination.
And imagination helps you be innovative.
Yes.
You innovate something, you really create something, and then you have something like, podcasts.
Yeah.
But imagination is so important that there's a certain very large production company which calls their writers and their producers Imagineers.
Yes.
I love that.
And,
Exactly.
Disney, right?
Mm-hmm.
And because that's important. They emphasize the imagination.
Mm-hmm.
But Nicole, wouldn't you agree with me that the younger a child begins to read and is encouraged to keep reading, that gives them permission to use their imagination?
Yes, not only permission, but just general access to their imagination. Because little children are naturally imaginative.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Because they're taking in so much of the world around them that they don't understand. So it's leaving it to their own tiny, young, but relevant interpretation. So when you feed that, it helps them sharpen that skill, and you just never know where they'll take it.
Mm-hmm. It's so funny. I may have mentioned it before, but when I was 5 years old, I remember watching television and wondering where those pictures came from. Using my imagination, I figured they were coming through the plug in the wall, and that's that's where it was coming from. So it's. I mean, later on I found out what we all know about that, but I was using my imagination, and when you write science fiction, sometimes you can use almost that child imagination within you to come up with some interesting ideas. So I saw a movie once where people got sucked into a video game. It was recently. I was Jumanji with The Rock and with Kevin Hart, and they got sucked into the video game. So as a little kid, I would say that probably could happen. I mean, if it could come out, then it can go in. And so, but sometimes if you can tap that childhood imagination that we all have within us, that'll help you with writing science fiction.
Oh yes, and just going back to what you were saying about teaching, getting kids to read, not kids, just kids, but young adults to read while they're young, gives them permission to use their imagination, as you said, but I think it gives them permission to explore it. Neil deGrasse Tyson was talking, a physicist, if you don't know him, was talking about children being scientists, and all that they do is an experiment, and to tell them to stop doing what they're doing, or to inhibit that is to inhibit their intellectual growth in some way. I'm paraphrasing.
Absolutely.
But I think imagination is that same way, to not allow a child to explore the depths of their imagination to an extent inhibits their ability to be creative and to be imaginative. And I think in some ways that can affect them on a professional level, because our dreamers are those who have created things like
those are our inventors,
MGM
right?
and Disney and SpaceX and Virgin and all of these
rockets to the moon,
fantastic
right
things. And I think by saying no, okay, it's not real, stop doing that, you're not really on the moon, can cause damage in a sense. Would you agree? Would you say that's...
It makes me think of Robert Goodert. Robert Goodert was a boy who dreamed of making rockets and sending rockets into space. He was one of the first people to come up with a liquid fuel rocket. He was just a kid when he was thinking about these things, and as he grew up, he became a rocketeer, and he invented and perfected fuel systems for rocketry. And I think it led his dream, his imagination led to the rockets that we have today, the rockets that took us to the moon, the rockets that bring satellites.
And all of that from the imagination as a kid.
Right.
And imagine, when you were a kid, you imagined what it must have been like to see Santa Claus grow up and be a child like you, or to be a young adult. And imagine there was a place you could go where you could find that out. And as a matter of fact, there is. If you go to www.troopbooks.com, T-R-O-U-P. You can go to facebook.com. Thank you. You can go to our Instagram, our TikTok, and check out troopbooks.com. If you go to the website, you can land on the author page where you can pick up a hardcover or a soft cover. And as we wind down to this podcast, I just want to say thank you so much for pressing the play button, and I look for you next time on Conversations with the Authors.